Sway, Bobby Rydell, a teen idol who was so cool that he had a school named after him. Fame is a fickle mistress. In pop and rock, you can never predict for sure which song and shows will go down well with the public. Sometimes you get artists or performances which seem certain to drive fans wild, and then, for whatever reason, they just don't happen. Bobby Rydell, now he was a different matter. Bobby had also been a bit of a child prodigy. He'd been in a US telly show called TV Teen Club when he was 8, and then drummed in rock and roll bands in his teens. He'd even been in a youthful band with Frankie Avalon called Rocco and the Saints. But Bobby's career really took off when he got a solo record deal in 1959. He had a US hit with Kissing Time, then a top 10 smash with We Got Love. His debut album, also called We Got Love, sold 1 million copies, and while we were out on tour, he was number 2 in the American chart with Wild One. And Bobby Rydell absolutely killed it on the biggest show of stars for 1960. He went down a storm every single night. As I said, Clyde McPhatter raised the roof, as did we. Then the same girls who'd been yelling, "I love you, Cliff," at me, began screaming, "I love you, Bobby." Ha! Some people have no loyalty. I'm joking, of course. With his dimples and perfect quiff, Bobby looked terrific on stage and was a slick performer. I loved watching him. What was amazing was that he was even younger than me, still only 17. That was a new one for me. Up till then, I'd assumed that everybody in music was older than me. Because Bobby and I were the youngest people on the tour, we maybe gravitated towards each other. We'd hang out backstage and sometimes sat together on the tour bus as it pulled through the dark nights to the next city. In fact, a lot of the social life on that tour happened at night on those buses. We'd all still be on a high from the shows, and those night drives through the ever-changing landscapes felt like yet another exciting element of our great American adventure. We would all be chattering away animatedly, then the bus would stop in the early hours and we'd pile into an all-night diner. It was very easy to get carried away in those diners and order burger and chips at 2 a.m, or coffee with half milk, half cream, or beer, and I did. When I got home from America, I weighed myself. Gulp. 12.5 stone. I had to go on a crash diet. I've never been that heavy since. Bobby Rydell and I had a lot in common. We were both teenagers who'd been catapulted to fame and suddenly had girls screaming at us. You'd have thought we'd have talked a lot about that and compared notes. But we didn't. Mostly our bus chats were about music and the artists we love. I remember being very impressed that Bobby could play drums. He told me he'd been a singing drummer in some bands. I gather that when singers play Las Vegas, audiences like it if they can also drum. Bobby did Vegas in his later years, so I bet that talent stood him in good stead. I liked Bobby Rydell, and because we'd got on so well in America, I followed his career when I got back home. He had a couple of hits in Britain late in 1960. They weren't what you'd call rock and roll, but they were terrific. He sang a big smoochy romantic ballad called Volare. You heard it a lot around that time. It had been a hit in Britain in 1958 for a guy called Domenico Modugno, who'd sung it for Italy in the Eurovision Song Contest. But I liked Bobby Rydell's follow-up even more. It's still one of my favorite songs of all time. It was called Sway, and I thought that it was absolutely phenomenal. Sway was such a gem of a song. It began with swinging bossa nova rhythms and pops of brass. Then in came Bobby's voice, sounding rich and resonant. When marimba rhythms start to play, dance with me. It had lustrous strings, cherubic backing vocals, a killer beat. In fact, it had pretty much everything. Apparently, Sway had been written by 2 Mexican composers in 1953, So in a way, I guess Bobby and his producers were doing the same thing as with Volare, taking an exotic foreign song and anglicizing it. Well, it worked. It was a dream of a song and a big hit on both sides of the Atlantic. I liked getting into songs like Sway, which weren't classic rock and roll, and they also shaped the way that my career was about to go. Norrie Paramore always paid attention to what was happening in the charts. Well, it was his job, and he was keen to widen my appeal beyond just teenagers. That was why Norrie had started getting me to make albums like 1959's Cliff Sings. It was new territory for me. Half of the tracks were rock and roll songs with the Shadows. The other half was me singing songs by such venerable composers as George and Ira Gershwin with the Norrie Paramore Orchestra. I like to mix it up. I always have done. I suppose by now I was taking the same journey as Bobby Rydell, from being a teen idol to becoming a more mature artist. I was certainly realizing that what they call the Great American Songbook holds many classic tunes that are going to be around forever, and that I would dearly love to sing those tunes. The interesting thing is that I probably ended up making that transition slightly more successfully than dear old Bobby. With a few exceptions after Volare and Sway, his singles all seemed to come to rest lower and lower in the US charts. He only really had one further big hit, Forget Him, a cool, romantic rock and roll number in late 1963. I suppose that Bobby was another all-American star who got swept away by the musical British invasion of his country in the mid-60s. I still think that is a real shame, especially as at least one of the bands in the vanguard of that invasion were huge fans of his. Acknowledging his influence, Paul McCartney was to admit that the Beatles were such big Bobby Rydell fans that they had based She Loves You, with its musical call and response structure, on one of his songs. It's funny, I would never have linked those two artists, but now I can totally see the connection. As his record sales fell away, Bobby Rydell made TV shows and played Vegas and club gigs. He always continued to tour, right up until his death in 2022. He was part of a singing package tour called the Golden Boys with Frankie Avalon and another late 50s teen idol, Fabian Forte. Looking back, it's the weirdest thing. I had the time of my young life on that biggest show of stars for 1960 tour with Clyde McPhatter and Sammy Turner, the Isley Brothers, Bobby Rydell. We became a little gang. Then the tour ended and we went our separate ways and never saw each other again. Why was that? Well, for one thing, it was a lot harder to keep in touch in those days. Today, you can send somebody an email or message them on social media or pull a phone smaller than a cigarette packet out of your pocket and text them. They will read it in a minute. As they say, we live in a global village. Back in 1960, life was different. To keep in touch with someone in another part of the world, you'd have to make a prohibitively expensive international phone call, if you even had a phone, that is. Or you'd have to sit down, write a letter, post it, and wait weeks for a reply. And how many teenagers want to do that? We were in the flush of youth, people like Bobby Rydell and me, and we thought the thrills and the adventures would never end. If we thought about it at all, we just assumed that we'd see each other again some point further down the line. But then life takes over and other things happen. You move on. Instead of staying in close touch, you lose contact, and you just catch occasional chance glimpses of one another as the years go by. And that happened for me with these guys, courtesy of one of the biggest musical films of the 70s. When my close friend Olivia Newton-John became a global superstar in Greece in 1978, I couldn't have been more delighted for her. For one reason or another, I didn't get round to see the movie for a while. For 20 years, in fact. But when I finally did, a couple of things about it seemed very familiar. There was Frankie Avalon as teen angel, middle-aged but still trim, clad head to toe in white, strolling down from heaven to croon a funny song called Beauty School Dropout. And what was the name of the school where Olivia as Sandy and John Travolta as Danny studied, played, sang, danced, and fell in love? It was Rydell High School, named after Bobby Rydell. Now that is what you call a musical legacy.